Psychedelic rock is one of the most iconic genres ever, so it's no coincidence that Travis Scott sampled it twice on Rodeo, Kanye sampled it on one of his most iconic songs ever, and even Rihanna covered a Tame Impala song directly influenced by it. But what is it about this genre that's allowed it to maintain its influence for over 50 years, and how can we, the producers of today, learn from it and use that in our own music? When you think of rock, you think of the guitar, so I knew that's where I wanted to begin. After doing some research, I quickly discovered that the Fender Stratocaster was commonly used by the Beatles, Pink Floyd, etc. And it just so happens that I have one myself. If you listen to the 8-bar section that was sampled, you can hear the guitar hits on the 1, and then it comes back in at the end for the last 4 bars. With all that in mind, let's lay something down. In the 60s and 70s, bands were limited to what was available at the time, so guitars were often run through tube amps made by Fender, Gibson, Vox, etc. To emulate that, the first plugin I added is Stark by Clevgrand. I chose the British Guitar A1 model for the amp and I set it to drive. For the cabinet, I selected the wide large preset and I turned the reverb all the way off because we're going to add one later on. More important than the amps in achieving this psychedelic sound is the guitar pedals used. The one pedal I've added inside Stark is the vibrato. Next, I added this real ADT from Waves. This just helps to widen the guitar even more. Of course, the Beatles are famous for recording their songs at Abbey Road Studios. So for the reverb, I chose Abbey Road Chambers by Waves. Next, I added this tape delay from Arturia. After that, I added a compressor just to tighten the sound up. Next, one of the key components for achieving this sound is the King's microphone from Waves. Obviously, in the 60s and 70s, the microphones weren't of the quality that they are today. So the King's microphone helps emulate that. I chose the 3rd preset on King George V. And finally, I've got an EQ, cutting the low end out and boosting some of the highs. Another key component I noticed with the guitars is they often pan them to one side. So for this sample, I've panned the guitar to the right and I've made it almost fully mono. Next, I moved on to the bass. Now the Beatles famously used the Hofner 500-1 bass, also known as the violin bass due to its shape. I found a perfect replica inside Modo bass. So if we move over to play style, I've selected finger picking and I've muted it 100%. To me, this just sounded the best. After looking into it a little bit, I found that the Beatles used the Fender Bassman amps on their basses. So I found a replica of that inside Amplitube. And I also added a CLA 76 from Waves to heavily compress it. And alongside the guitar, it sounds like this. After looking to the Beatles for inspiration for the guitar and the bass, I wanted to take a step back and take a deeper dive into the psych rock genre. The most recognizable part of the Wasted sample is the flute. A band famous for using flutes in rock music is Jethro Tull, a British group formed in the 60s. The first thing I noticed was the long silver concert flute being used. After a little bit of searching, I found the Passion Flutes Contact Bank by Orange Tree Samples, and this is going to fit perfectly for the sound we're going for. To this, I added some heavy compression, a very short reverb, and an EQ, cutting some low end and cutting a little bit of the high end. Like the guitar, I've made the flute almost completely mono and I've panned it to the left. Now we're moving on to the vocals. After looking on Reddit, doing some research, seeing what people had to say, one common thing stood out to me is to do double takes. I recorded these vocals twice. I tried to get it as accurate as possible on each one so they sounded exactly the same. First of all is an EQ, cutting some of the low end out, also cutting some high end out. I noticed on lots of the vocals in these songs, they're kind of pushed back in the mix. Again, I've used Abbey Road Chambers for the reverb, added some compression, and I also added this plugin called Speakers. Now that's sounding good, but I wanted to use one special trick that the Beatles used on the song Blue Jay Way. What they did was record the entire song backwards through a Leslie, then they would chop certain parts to lead into the main vocal. So what I did was bounce out the vocal, reverse it, and I chopped two little parts here to fit in where I thought it would sound good. And to that I added a phaser and a vintage verb. The final element of this sample is the drums. The Beatles famously used the Ludwig Oyster Black Pearl drum kit, and there's actually a replica of that in Addictive Drums too. I laid down this very simple bounce with the snares hitting normally, the kicks are very spaced out. I pushed some of the notes back randomly here and there just to give a more natural feel. To that, I added this EQ from Waves and another EQ, cutting some of the high end, cutting some of the low end out. I think the final step is to structure the sample a little bit. What I'm going to do is highlight these vocals and bring them back. So we've got a section without the vocals and then the vocals will come in. So yeah, let's listen to the final sample. So what did we learn from studying 1970s psych rock? For me, the first thing that comes to mind is the panning. On most of the songs, instruments were dramatically panned left or right. As long as you fill both sides with different things, it creates a full mix. The second thing I learned when you're trying to achieve this vintage sound is to really go in depth and understand what was it like trying to make music back then. Like I discovered, lots of the microphones had a natural roll off at 100 Hz. Applying that to my sample, especially with the bass, it gave it so much more of a natural feel. And the third thing I learned is to be creative, push your boundaries. The reverse vocal trick that I showed you was unheard of when the Beatles did it. It just shows that there's no real rules in music. You can do what you want to, experiment with things, try new things. You never know what you might discover. But yeah, that's it for today's video. I really hope you guys learned from this. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a like, please leave a comment. Let me know if there's any other genres you want me to dive into. Of course, don't forget to subscribe and I'll see you guys in the next one.